So why W210 E Class? Well, at the time, this was a very good example of one. It had only 92,500 kilometres, it was a reasonable car, it was very cheap for what it was, and I was after an old Mercedes because I was looking for something that was automatic, that fits my size 14 feet, and was comfortable for me to drive, and this was a car that I found for the price I was looking at. And it needed a bit of work because the car hadn't moved for a very long time. I was looking at S's, looking at other E's, and they all seemed to be either really ordinary or they're really expensive. And this one was a really good car for a really good price. And I figured, well, never had one of these. Let's take the plunge and find out. And I'm glad I did. 2 years later, it's been a great car. It's been reliable. It's been easy to maintain. It's been wonderful to drive. It's done lots of things in that time for me and done a lot in terms of driving enjoyment. And I'm really happy to have it. Looking back now, I wouldn't have changed a thing. I'm very glad I have this car. I think I'll continue to have this for quite a while because I absolutely love this car.
In the 2 years I've had this W210, there's been a few issues I've had to solve. First and foremost, when I got the car, was the engine mounts. The engine was sagging a little bit and it was found that the mounts were on their way out. Common issue with some of the Mercedes, the Lemfurter engine mounts do like to sag as they get older, as they did in this car. They were the original 1997 mounts. So, as a wear and tear item, they had to be replaced. Another issue that was wear and tear that had to be replaced was the lower control arms and their ball joints on this car. My E230 had sat for a prolonged period of time, around 3 years, because the original owner couldn't drive the car anymore. And that meant all the bushings were completely torn, and being the original 97 bushings, they didn't age very well. So they had to be replaced on the lower control arm. Other thing they were replacing on that car was the water pump. It had been quite noisy and was at the end of its life. Again, it was the original 97 water pump. Another common issue with this car was the timing chain, and it was dealt with. It seems to be a common issue amongst the Mercedes lineup. Some it afflicts more than others, and on mine, it needed to be done at 90,000 Ks in 17 years. Engines available in the W210 in Australia. When it was first launched in January 1996, you had two options, the M104 inline 6 in the E320, and the M111 inline 4 in the E230. Now, this continued until March-April 1997, where the M104 was replaced by the M112 V6 engine. In August 1997, the M111 E230 was replaced by the M112 powered E240. The M111 would come back in 2000 for the 2001 model year as the E200 compressor, but it was mostly powered by the M112 engine from there on in, with the exception of the M113 V8s and the E430 and E55 AMGs.
Inside, the W210 E Class is a wonderful place to be. Every control falls to hand, air conditioning, the Eurovox tape deck in this Australian car, electric windows down here. The only thing that really bothers me is that ASR button here is the same proximity to the passenger electric window switch as it is to the gear knob when it's in D, so you actually sometimes accidentally press this button when you want to lower the passenger window, which is a bit of an annoying thing. But apart from that, everything else is wonderfully thought out. It's got a foot-mounted park brake, which if you're not careful will hit your foot when you pull it up when you're trying to move. But everything feels well made, everything feels wonderful, everything feels like it falls to hand. There's just an air of quality in this car that even though it's not as well made as some of the older ones are, it still feels like it's been put together so it would last 100 years. It feels fantastic, and from where I'm sitting, nice clear instruments, nice three-pointed gun sight on the bonnet, and a wonderfully big steering wheel, which Mercedes-Benz don't do this type of wheel anymore, but I really, really like it. I'm really upset they don't, even though when it's hot it can be a little bit hot to touch. As a car, as a place to be, it's fantastic.
In terms of body issues, the W210 does have a history with corrosion in countries that use salt on the roads during winter. So if you're in a country where it snows and salt is used on the roads, look for corrosion on these cars. Now, being of the 1990s Euro car vintage with the water-based paints, you can get lacquer peel on these cars as well because of the early water-based paints, and they didn't stand up to the course of time too well. It took a while for the water-based paints to actually become a lot more stronger in terms of colour retention and lacquer retention. And if you're buying an early model W210, please look out for these areas in terms of lack of peel, mostly on the roof and mostly on the surfaces that hit the sun, so roof, boot and bonnet. Next thing to look for is a dash cluster. Now, the dash clusters on E320s, particularly the early ones, were known to fail, so make sure you check this. And also, if it's had a replacement dash cluster, make sure it's been notified the mileage that the cluster was replaced at, because sometimes they'll zero the odometer, which might be difficult now coming to look at the car if you don't already know that and there's no history of it. So always check the dash cluster on the early cars. Later cars also are prone to having issues, so the later 2000 to 2002 model years, their clusters can go fuzzy, particularly on the park display and where the clock is located. So check the two outer dials to see if the cluster is fuzzy or not. Other thing to look for with the W210 is accident damage. Now, there's been quite a few cars that have been put back on the road after having accidents because at the time they had the crash, they were quite valuable. So make sure you check all the areas for panel gaps to be uniform, and also check the paint colours on all the panels. Now, my car's had some minor work done. The panel gaps are pretty straight, but the paint colour is different on the guard and the bumper. Now, that is because my car on the right-hand side lived in a very small and tight garage, and the previous owner did hit that side, so always check this out. My car also had all the information of all the work done too, which was a very, very good thing. But when you come to look at these cars, look front, look rear, look side, check the panel gaps. They should be straight, they should be uniform, and the colours should all match. If they don't, ask a few questions and have a closer look underneath. Something else to look for is the maintenance. Now, one-owner cars like mine with full service history should be well maintained. Now, albeit my car having things that said that were done that weren't done, on the whole, it was a very well maintained car. But if you find a car that's had multiple owners, that looks like it's been owned by someone who hasn't got the money, then this car could be trouble moving forward. Always check the history. If it has no history, ask the previous owner how long they've had it for. If this car's been owned by someone for a very short period of time and looks like it's been relatively poorly maintained, then you'll be in for some pretty big bills to deal with all the deferred maintenance. There's not a lot that goes wrong with the car, just general maintenance work on W210s, but if you don't maintain the car, more issues will come. So always check how well maintained the car is, check all changes have been done every 10 to 15,000 Ks, and also check if the transmission fluid's been changed, the car's got over 100,000 kilometres. So always make sure this car's been properly looked after is the main aim here. If you buy a well looked after 210, it will look after you. By a bad example, it'll be a money pit. Because like many old Euros, once the maintenance goes down from one owner, the bills for the next owner go through the roof. As they age, the bills get higher. They are quite needy if they're not well maintained. So always make sure you look at the car, look at the person, look at the service history, look at all the factors and make a judgment there to see whether this car is going to be a good one or whether this one is going to eat through $100 notes like Smarties.
So, driving this car, W210 E Class, I come to realise something. When I drive this, and then I go and drive something a bit newer, I find myself wanting to drive this again. I find myself wanting to climb into this car and drive it. Whether it be a newer SUV, newer sedan, all bar a couple of cars, I actually would drive in preference to this. As most cars I wouldn't drive in preference to this. Having driven so many newer cars, having driven so many different types of cars, I seem to find myself wanting to drive this one quite a lot, especially on a highway run like this. And that's because of a few things. Number one, the ride and handling is really nice. The 2.3 litre engine, which is quite far back over the front axle, it's not sitting over the front axle, it's actually further behind. It's still a front engine car obviously, but there's not a lot of weight bearing over the front end, which means it handles really well. And that 5-link rear suspension that Mercedes spent an absolute fortune on in the 70s and 80s to try and keep up with the Jaguar XJ6, which this one does remind me of my grandma's old 1975 Jaguar XJ6 Daimler, means it rides beautifully. The ride and handling on this car, the compromise with the smaller wheels,
horse, a smaller engine, and this suspension on this car is a very, very good one. There's only a handful of cars that seem to have a better ride and handling compromise than this. Unfortunately, one of them was one of the cars that the E Class was competing with. In terms of ride and handling, this and the small engine D39 5 Series, I'd say pretty much almost level pegging. Maybe the BM handles a bit better and the Merc rides a bit better. But back then in the late 90s, if you wanted one of these cars, big Euro, small engine, you were sport for choice. You had two very, very good cars in the E and the 5. At the end of the day, when you stare over this three-pointed gun sight on the bonnet, feel the wonderful steering, the wonderful suspension, sit in a wonderfully comfortable interior that's everything, all the controls, easy to hand, it's well built, it feels nice. You think, why am I bothering with so many other cars? Why don't I just get myself another E Class? This 4-cylinder E Class does a great job in terms of ride and handling. The lighter engine means the car handles wonderfully. The ride's great. There's really, in all fairness, not much wrong with this car. Okay, it's a 25-year-old car, and yes, even though it's been reliable, it's not always going to be perfect, but as a daily driver or a second car, it's fantastic. There's so many other cars out there that don't do anything like what this thing does for more money. It really shows that these old Mercedes-Benzes are every bit as timeless as they were new as they are now. They're fantastic cars, and if you want a cheap, budget, practical classic, then I thoroughly recommend you buy a W210 E Class. Just make sure the one you buy is a well-maintained, well-cared-for example.